At Seoul 1988, in the Olympic football tournament, something is terribly wrong for Italy. Gli Azzurri are on the rise again, and their second opponent here is coming off a draw with Iraq. Just months after their Euro 88 semi-final appearance, and 2 years before a World Cup semi-final, this should have been easy for them, but their completely unknown opponent comes out fighting. After going blow for blow through the first half, the opponent's best player uncorks a long-range strike to open the scoring. Meet Kalusha Bwalya of Zambia. He first shows up in rosters in 1979 in a Zambian club called Mufulira Blackpool, then quickly moves to Mufulira Wanderers, the most famous club in Zambia, where he impressed over a 5-year stint. There are no concrete statistical records of how he actually performed for Wanderers, no highlights, very few images of Bwalya in a Mufulira kit. There isn't even a record of how many goals he scored for his first senior club. 35 years after the Seoul Olympics, this game's highlights have been preserved on videotapes that can be accessed today. It's the earliest moments where we can see the evidence of Zambia's rise, and that of Kalusha Bwalya and the rest of an ascendant Zambia side. It captures for the first time in images that survive, Kalusha Bwalya slicing through defenses with his eye for the minutest spaces. His second goal would announce to the world his talent from the free kick, something he would become known for as he deceives the keeper, the legendary Stefano Tacconi. Johnson Bwalya, no relation to Kalusha, piled on a third from a deflection, and then Kalusha finished his hat-trick with a fourth goal. Derby McKinka would be a midfield creative as part of this team, and in defense there was Samuel Chamba and keeper David Efford Chabala. Zambia would advance top of their group, but would be unsurprisingly stopped by West Germany, who were the best team in the world at the time, in the middle of a run of 3 straight World Cup finals. The story of Zambian football is above all else a story of geography. More than perhaps any other sports story, their story shows the power of place, both in the large-scale flows that determine global and continental footballing power, and in those micro-geographies, the energy and meaning that build up in individual spaces from events that occur there. On that larger scale, the main theme of African football has been the dominance of West and North African teams. Zambia, situated in southern Africa, sits outside of those traditional power areas. Often, the base level of resources simply isn't there. For the top tier of Zambian players, that means the best opportunities for club play are abroad, either in nearby countries or further afield, in Europe or elsewhere. As it was for Kalusha Bwalya. After 5 years at Wanderers, in 1985 he transferred for Cercle Bruges in Belgium, where he was playing at the time of the 1988 Olympics. Over his 3 full years in green and black there, he won the affection of the fans, winning the Supporters Award in 2 of 3 seasons in Bruges. Johnson Bwalya, for his part, would also have a long career in Europe, between several Swiss clubs. With a golden generation here, the team known at the time as the KK11, for Kenneth Kaunda, Zambia's 27-year president, would look to break through the paradigm of Southern Africa's footballing futility and finally compete. In 1990, after narrowly missing out on the World Cup, the KK11 looked to the Africa Cup of Nations. The AFCON, as it is often known, is the all-continent football tournament of Africa, first held in 1957. Since it began, there have only ever been brief incursions of countries from outside of North or West Africa into the top echelons of the tournament, and since the mid-1970s, those historically strong footballing regions have had a complete chokehold on the tournament's top prize. In 1990, Zambia had an extremely humble history in the AFCON, only reaching the final once in 1974, which they lost in a replay against Zaire, and since then only once earning third in 1982, a relatively recent success which has nevertheless completely failed to roll over into the current generation. In 1990, an extremely young and promising new Zambian side approached the tournament with hopes of success for the first time in years. The keeper, Kalusha Bwalya, at only 30 years old, was the oldest player on the team. However, several other players will be forced out of the side due to injuries or other factors. Kalusha Bwalya, injured in the quarterfinal defeat to West Germany back in the 1988 Seoul Olympics, hadn't regained his form and would be absent, while Kalusha had sustained a heartbreaking hamstring injury just 1 week before the start of tournament play. Charles Musonda, another top Zambian player, was playing for PSV Eindhoven in Netherlands at the time. Since they had a cup final to compete for, Musonda would have to stay over in Europe to play that game, instead of competing for Zambia in the AFCON. Nevertheless, this young but depleted Zambia squad set out to compete against the giants of their continent. In a tournament where only 8 sides qualified, there would be no easy matches. First up, Cameroon. This side were the defending champs from 1988 and the favorites. In just a few months, Cameroon will go off to the World Cup in Italy in '90 and will beat Argentina, the defending world champions, top their group, then advance to the quarterfinals with a win over Colombia, the first ever African side to get that far, and they will be denied from the semifinals only by a couple of iffy penalty calls given to England at that stage. Here in the AFCON, not much footage survives of the clash between the KK11 and Cameroon, but what remains captures a persistent Cameroonian attack, including this opportunity that Kalusha Bwalya brilliantly has to save. Out of a corner in the 56th minute, Webster Chikabala arrives on the scene to head in the winner. Even without their top stars, the Zambian style of holding firm under intense pressure that would define them through multiple generations of talent was evident. By the end of the tournament, defender Samuel Chamba would land at the best 11, and it's hard to imagine that Kalusha Bwalya wasn't close to getting a best 11 shout himself. They would hold on to win this match against Cameroon, and eventually finish group play without conceding a single goal, defeating Kenya 1-0 and drawing scoreless against Senegal, 2 matches from which no footage survives. Against Nigeria in the semi-finals, the KK11 would finally meet their match. Nigeria's story is one that deserves its own telling, but the squad that Zambia would eventually fall 2-0 to was just the groundwork for their famous mid-90s golden generation that would eventually win them both the AFCON and an Olympic gold medal in Atlanta '96. Uche Okechukwu put in a pinpoint header off a corner, and Rashidi Yakini, the eventual all-time goals leader for the Super Eagles, would finish on a stylish volley, and they would advance to the final, sending Zambia to the 3rd place match against Senegal. Once again, no footage exists from that matchup, but Webster Chikabala's 2nd goal of the tournament, plus a 4th clean sheet in 5 matches, put them on the podium. Before the KK11 could get back to major tournament action, in 1991, the single-party rule that had given the Zambian side that moniker would come to an end through democratic elections that unseated Kenneth Kaunda, and the Zambian football team would come to be known affectionately as the Chipolo Polo, the Copper Bullets, owing to Zambia's copper industry, which, among other things, made Mufulira a big city, the place whose club had given many Zambian internationals, including Kalusha Bwalya, their start. That club was also the original proving ground for the 3 men who had coached Zambia into relative prominence, but as with the unseating of Kaunda's one-party rule, there were calls for new clubs to be represented in the coaching staff. As such, coaches from Power Dynamos, straight off their massive success at the beginning of the 90s, known as the Power 90 campaign, would end up as assistant coaches for the Chipolo Polo. However, this move would seem to backfire. The 1992 AFCON would be a down year for the newly renamed side, despite being able to field their top players. They beat Egypt 1-0 after some close control in the box and a bit of good luck for Kalusha Bwalya, back in the side, who was able to block a clearance straight into the net. But this would remain their last goal of the tournament. They snuck into the quarterfinals after a loss to Ghana, and they dragged Côte d'Ivoire to extra time thanks to some heroics from Chabala, but the Ivorians ultimately broke through and would go on to win the tournament themselves. In 1993, the task would be World Cup qualification. The Chipolo had never once reached the World Cup, but things finally looked good for them. Kalusha Bwalya would factor in, as well as the entire golden generation that had been brewing for years, whose early beginnings had destroyed Italy and soul, including Johnson Bwalya, who scored in that match and who had finally regained his form that he lost after his injury. This was by all accounts the best side that Zambia had ever produced. The first game of the final round of qualification would be in Dakar against Senegal. As they set out to play for their American summer, the cohort flying to Dakar from Zambia would never make it. Shortly after taking off after a refueling stop in Libreville, Gabon, the plane carrying most of the Zambian squad would crash into the Atlantic Ocean. All 25 people on board were killed. 18 players, including Derby Makinka, Samuel Chamba, and Efford Chabala, died in the crash. The only members of the team who remained were those who played abroad in Europe. Kalusha Bwalya, at the time a player for PSV Eindhoven, had been scheduled to travel straight to Dakar on his own, rather than with the team, something which had saved his life. He was already the leader of the Chipolo, but now he was alone. He had been able to ply his trade in Europe, but because of the 1993 plane crash, he would have to continue without those teammates who never got the chance. FIFA gave Zambia 6 weeks to regroup, and they would rebuild their side from those playing abroad and from fringe internationals, those who had played a few games with the national team but who had been left out of the squad that had intended to fly to Dakar. Their first game back would be played at home, against Morocco, a North African side and one of Africa's best teams. Rashid Daoudi scored a long-range goal for the Moroccans, and then they went into their shell trying to hold on to the points. In the 60th minute, Zambia got a free kick just outside the box. Kalusha Bwalya, free kick wizard in the heart of the resurrected Chipolo, stepped up. Then, just 7 minutes later, from the resurgent Johnson Bwalya. It was 2-1 in Lusaka's Independence Stadium, in loving memory. The Zambian victory that day would restore hope in the wake of a national disaster, both in a spiritual sense, along with establishing a concrete hope of making the World Cup. They would draw Senegal away in the match that was rescheduled, then demolish the same opponent at home 4-0. Needing only 1 point from an away fixture against Morocco, the Chipolo unfortunately couldn't get it done, falling out of contention after a 1-0 loss. They missed out on their fairy tale ending by just 1 point, and as such the enduring symbol of their immediate recovery from tragedy is the 2-1 win in Lusaka. That game is only preserved through sparse highlight footage with only field-level angles, an unfortunate commonality from the time and place, but it still gives us just enough to sense the emotion in that venue, from the team's celebrations after each goal to the fans in attendance, some of whom seem to have gotten on the field after the final whistle and who can be seen around Kalusha Bwalya as he gives his post-match remarks. The final redemption for the Chipolo, though, would have to wait. In AFCON 1994, they played a sleepy draw against Sierra Leone, then would have to face Côte d'Ivoire, the defending champions who eliminated them 2 years earlier, returning largely the same squad. Due to the 3-team group structure, though, and Côte d'Ivoire's 4-0 win over Sierra Leone, Zambia just had to avoid a complete meltdown. They instead held firm and denied the Ivorians any real sight of goal. Harrison Chongo and Elijah Litana would go on to become all-Tournament 11 players by the end of this AFCON, and it's for matches like this where they never even allowed the opponents to get close to scoring. In the last stretch of the match, with both teams' safety secure, the Chipolo took an unexpected win off this gorgeous threaded ball that led Kenneth Bubbles Malatoli in on goal. They would play Senegal in the quarterfinal. Evan Sakala there hit from range with a dream goal, and they would never look back, taking that 1-0 win into the semifinals to face upstarts Mali. Within 8 minutes, Elijah Litana, who had already established himself as one of the side's best in defense, lashed a header in and the keeper couldn't deal with it, giving Zambia the early 1-0 lead. Mali never recovered, conceding on this silly giveaway, then allowing 2 more goals, one of those from the captain. In 1988, the generation that would die in a plane crash had announced itself with a 4-0 win over Italy in the Olympics. And here with this 4-0, the resurrected Chipolopolo, playing in remembrance of their fallen teammates, would put themselves on the doorstep of the ultimate redemption. In the final in Tunis, they would face their toughest challenge. Nigeria, the team that handed them a 2-0 defeat 4 years earlier, was back with their best ever squad. The Super Eagles sported one of the greatest rosters ever for an African team, with JJ Okocha, Emmanuel Amunike, Daniel Amokachi, and Rashidi Yakini with 5 goals already in the tournament. After a start that seemed to favor Nigeria, the brilliant Litana headed home a corner kick to secure an early lead in just the 3rd minute. The Zambians hadn't conceded a single goal all tournament, and would have looked to lock down the game once again behind their brilliant defense. But just 2 minutes after the goal, Emmanuel Amunike scored on a corner kick play to equalize. After that, the Nigerian side had all the chances. Despite a solid Zambian defense, the Super Eagles were just too dangerous. They scored at the very beginning of the second half, and Zambia couldn't recover, even with some big chances. They gave everything they had, but against the best team on the continent, it just wasn't enough. The story of the reassembled Chipolopolo rising out of tragedy to defeat the best side in Africa and take home the continent's most sought-after trophy was just too good to happen. In the 1996 AFCON, the Chipolopolo played a dominant group stage, winning 5-1 and 4-0. These were Kalusha Bwalya's finest couple games, scoring 5 goals between them, from the free kick once, and also with a deft touch here, and then multiple times chipping the keeper, and evading the defense with a little acceleration and quick touch to put himself in for a calm finish. In the quarterfinals, their matchup would be against Egypt. Egypt went ahead 1-0, but Zambia had the strength of a team whose time had truly come. Here we see some dogged defense in the final third that gets the ball to Kalusha Bwalya. With a trademark dribble move, he gets the ball out of a double team, and the cross swings in. Elijah Litana, the defensive centerpiece and set-piece threat, smashes a header right past the keeper to tie. Later, Andrew Tembo dribbles his defender and crosses it in, and Johnson Bwalya's header is deflected out to an oncoming Vincent Mutale for the go-ahead. Morden Malatoli, the brother of Kenneth Bubbles, would feed Dennis Lota for the third, all within 18 minutes. This side were playing better than any Zambian side had ever done before them, and looked to have a great chance at the tournament, especially in an AFCON without Nigeria for political reasons, and where other traditional powerhouse nations arrived with weaker than usual teams. Mice and men, though. In an uncharacteristic meltdown, Zambia allowed 3 goals in the semi-final against Tunisia, and then a 4th for a good measure after they pulled one back, eventually going down 4-2. They would beat Ghana to secure 3rd place in what amounted to a consolation match, as South Africa went on to become a super rare Southern African champion of the tournament. Kalusha Bwalya's tournament this year was the greatest of his career. He scored 5 goals. With this weakened AFCON field, it's hard not to wonder whether this could and should have been the year for Zambia. Instead, it was their last good chance. In each of the next 3 tournaments, Zambia would fall in the group stages, and they wouldn't even qualify in 2004. Johnson Bwalya, after also starring in that 1996 run, would be excluded from 1998's team after not attending team meetings. Elijah Litana would retire in 2000. Kalusha Bwalya, the heart of the Chipolopolo for over a decade, would play his last club football in 2000. In the 2006 World Cup qualification effort, Kalusha Bwalya had moved up to manage his side. Against Liberia, the game was ticking towards its end goalless in Lusaka's Independence Stadium. Against a typically inferior opponent, Zambia really needed the points, especially playing at home, where they've always had their greatest moments. In the 89th minute, the Chipolopolo were awarded a free kick in a dangerous spot. How Kalusha used to love to hit these, from his shocking near-post free kick goal in the 4-0 against Italy, to his equalizer in the wake of disaster against Morocco in this very stadium, to that free kick against Burkina Faso in the 1996 tournament that would announce the beginning of another run for the title, though ultimately unsuccessfully. Here in 2004, even his brightest of stars has faded out, and the last reminder of that extraordinary era where Zambia rebounded from national tragedy to nearly claim glory multiple times is now sitting on the bench. And we miss Kalusha's play here, how he always seemed to be able to make something out of nothing, like against Egypt in 1996 dribbling out of that double team, but all of that lives in the past now. A substitution is made for the free kick. Kalusha Bwalya. Listed as the manager, he called his own number and substituted himself on. King Kalu, as the fans called him, the legendary free kick taker, at 41 years of age, steps up.
Let's see how Kalu is going to take that one. It's a goal! It's a goal! It's a goal! It's a goal! Kalu! Kalu!
All logic says that this should not have gone the way that it did. Why was Kalusha prepared to sub himself on as a national team player-manager? How did a 41-year-old 4 years removed from his playing days manage to launch one last free kick goal? But the Chipolopolo seem to command some sort of magic when at home in the Independence Stadium, where they can shut out the outside world and its tragedy and the limitations that generally govern the game, like those that come with age, and create a beautiful, ridiculous image. Every player runs to mob the great Bwalya, as do some of the police stationed around the grounds. The commentators are next to openly weeping in the commentary box.
That is the man! We are doing this commentary with tears of joy.
This is just the fourth match in a 10-match qualifying set, and they celebrate it as if they've won the entire World Cup. Despite the small practical significance of this goal, just 3 points instead of 1 in one match, they did so with good reason. It's a rare moment, the closing of a chapter. This was the last true moment of the resurrected Zambia era, and for Kalusha as a player, like a supernova, glorious and final. They will ultimately be unsuccessful in their qualification bid and get group staged in the 2006 AFCON, but the moment itself is singular. Kalusha was the last player from the 90s squads to play for the Chipolopolo, and Zambia would go into a fallow period after he finally retired for real. Kalusha had started this era with a free kick back in '93 against Morocco, and he ended this era with another, 11 years later, the last play of his career. The resurrected Chipolopolo era would end with a triumph, not final and complete, but real nonetheless. However, when a chapter closes, a new one begins. Another substitute from the match was a 22-year-old up-and-comer named Christopher Katongo. Katongo would be the engine of the Zambian side for years to come. A goal-scoring threat, he would announce himself in earnest with the 2007 hat-trick against South Africa that led to what must be one of the hardest sub-headlines in BBC Sport history. In 2010, Zambia would make it out of the group stage for the first time since '96, and once again face Nigeria, in the midst of another golden generation for the Super Eagles that would take them to the World Cup. They fought and dragged it to penalties, but Thomas Nyirenda of Zambia would be the only miss out of 10 shots, and Zambia would lose out in the quarterfinals. Having been unable to lead Zambia to glory as a player or as a manager, Kalusha Bwalya had resigned from the coaching job at the Chipolopolo after the AFCON group stage failure in 2006. In 2008, he had risen to become president of the Zambian Football Association, and in 2011, he would be instrumental in bringing back Hervé Renard to manage the team. The extremely fiery Frenchman's career is one of the more fascinating in football history, with his path taking him everywhere from an assistant role in Shanghai to leading the Saudi side that upset Argentina in the 2022 World Cup group stage. You most recently saw him as manager of France in the 2023 Women's World Cup. In 2008, he had spent some time managing Zambia, but left for a brief stretch before Kalusha brought him back in 2011. The 2012 Africa Cup of Nations then beckoned. In their first group stage match, they saw a Senegal side in an 18-year valley between two eras of success. Here, the key players of a new Zambian golden generation wouldn't take long to introduce themselves. Emmanuel Mayuka scores from a header to open their campaign in just the 12th minute, and he will have a great tournament as an offensive threat. After the goal, though, Senegal were right back at it. A near-post free kick is redirected on target and forces a quick save from Kennedy Mwene. A real personality keeper, Mwene will go on to become the most capped national team player in Zambia history, currently sitting just above the late Efford Shabala, and here he flexes the acrobatics and reactions that allowed him to hold down that role for so long. The eventual fourth most capped Zambian international is on this team as well, defender Joseph Musonda, regarded by many as something of a father figure on this side. Senegal, perhaps unduly buoyed by their chance, start pressing way up the pitch, and Christopher Katongo flashes his playmaking ability with a perfectly weighted ball and a counterattack that allows Rainford Kalaba to double the lead. Kalaba will be a big part of this team in the coming games, providing a creative spark that will eventually land him on the best 11 of the tournament. In the second match, on a rain-sodden pitch where the ball sometimes lands and stops, they were forced to be resilient amid terrible pitch conditions. They went down once, but an agile finish from Mayuka would bring them level. They went down again, but an Isaac Chansa incredible control and assist would do all the work to set up Katongo, although that didn't stop the latter from pulling out this outrageous backflip routine. They would draw this match 2-2. Their final group match would be against the hosts, Equatorial Guinea. This side are usually not a part of the world football landscape, but they're always troublesome in African play, and here at home they've gritted out 2 wins from their 2 previous games with late winners in both. They've held Zambia scoreless and generated chances of their own, until Christopher Katongo created his own luck and silenced the home crowd with a shot to the near post. The defense would hold firm in front of Mwene, and the Chipolopolo finished top of the group. Their reward for finishing top was an easier matchup in the quarterfinals. While the Equatorial Guineans who went through in second faced the Ivory Coast, the Zambians got to face Sudan. The 22-year-old Stapila Sunzu darted forward on Rainford Kalaba's cross and would provide the opener for the Zambians. He would be crucial in the tournament as well as a defensive presence. In the 65th minute, things became like paperwork for the Chipolopolo. Sudan's number 9, a forward, Massawi, somehow found himself as a defender in the box and horribly mistimed this challenge to both be sent off with a second yellow card and to gift a penalty to Christopher Katongo, which he scores on the rebound. A third goal for Zambia would move them on to face Ghana. This matchup would be a tall order for any team in the tournament, let alone the ultimate outsiders in Zambia. The Ayew brothers, John Mensah, and the talismanic Asamoah Gyan were just 2 years out from their famous 2010 World Cup run where they were 1 penalty kick away from the semis. As opposed to their super late penalty in 2010, in this game they get a penalty almost immediately as Kwadwo Asamoah gets chopped down in the box. Kennedy Mwene, a penalty specialist who will even take penalties himself and will score 13 goals that way over his career, stands in. A lot is made about England's dreadful history with the penalty, but Ghana is certainly the most cursed nation out there from the spot. That save by Kennedy brought up memories of their 2010 trauma, and it's impossible to know just how much the psychological effect of that save echoed throughout the match, but the tape shows an absolute masterclass from Kennedy Mwene, making key diving stops on multiple Ghana chances. In the 78th minute, with the score still goalless, Emmanuel Mayuka gets the ball outside the box and is swarmed by white shirts. Out of basically nothing with his back to the goal, he turns and loops the ball in off the far post to provide the go-ahead. Even after a takedown on a Zambia counterattack leads to a Ghana red card, the Black Stars keep pushing for their equalizer. In a chaotic scramble, the ball settles for Isaac Vorsa, whose shot is miraculously blocked, and Zambia will hold on and get their ultimate game. The Chipolo Polo had come from out of nowhere to reach the final of the Africa Cup of Nations. I did say earlier that Equatorial Guinea were the host nation, but since it's a small country divided between an island and a small strip of land, they had actually shared hosting duties with Gabon. Equatorial Guinea had hosted the opening match and the third place match, so the final, to balance things out, would take place in Gabon's capital city, Libreville. After making their way to the 2012 Africa Cup of Nations ultimate stage, the final would bring the Chipolo Polo back to the city where the 1993 air disaster had occurred. Upon arriving in Libreville, in one of the most extraordinary scenes in football history, the team traveled to the beach just a few hundred meters away from where the plane carrying their fallen predecessors had crashed. The team, led by Kalusha Bwalya, singing a Zambian funeral song, wade out to the water, the last point on land that the plane crossed before crashing, and lay wreaths. Then, after visiting the site where 18 footballers had died years earlier, they walked from the beach, still with life, and with a promise to fulfill. The side they would face in the final would be Côte d'Ivoire. Les Elephants were midway through their dilemma of having immensely talented and successful players who could not get it done for their country. They most likely expected to see Ghana there in the final, the continent's other powerhouse of the early 2010s, and were probably delighted to see little Zambia step up to face them instead. Les Elephants were replete with talent, Didier Drogba leading from the front, probably the best African player at the time, along with Gervinho and the Touré brothers, and other names that dotted the rosters of top European clubs. Whereas 17 of the Chipolo Polo's 23 players played for clubs either in Zambia or in nearby DRC or South Africa, the Ivorians had nobody still in local leagues, all of them having made it out to Europe or other prestigious situations. 18 years after their finals loss in 1994, they would once again be faced with the best team in the tournament in the final. In just the second minute, Rainford Kalaba and Christopher Katongo combined for a crafty corner kick and set up Nathan Sinkala, but he was denied by Boubacar Kopa Berry. One might have wondered if they had already squandered their best chance, especially against such a good side. Then Zambia take a huge blow as Joseph Musonda, the father figure, is forced off with an injury. Despite that loss, Zambia played an inspired game and didn't concede to simply parking the bus, but the Ivorians were the better side. The Chipolo Polo sustained some measure of balance until around 15 minutes into the second half, when the Ivorians turned it up and made their push for their first AFCON title in 20 years. Gervinho sliced into the box in the 69th minute, and a clumsy challenge from Isaac Chansa sent him to the floor. Didier Drogba, Africa's best player at the time, stepped up for what would in all likelihood be a game-winning penalty. With a second chance at the game, the Chipolo Polos sturdied themselves for a defensive struggle. The Ivorians were running rampant, but they could make nothing of their opportunities, and in extra time, they ran out of energy. Penalty kicks would decide the fate of the tournament, with Zambia going second. Cheick Tiote comes up first for the Ivorians and nails it, and then Christopher Katongo comes up and coolly deceives the keeper to set the tone for his side. Controversy ensues when Kennedy Mwene stops Sol Bamba, but sees his save called back for stepping off the line under dubious circumstances, and sees Bamba make the second attempt. Instead of the Zambians having the advantage, the shootout instead devolves into an agonizing affair, with every taker making their penalty. On the last shot of the first set of 5, Kennedy Mwene steps up himself as 5th taker, knowing that a miss will lose the final, and calmly scores, sending the shootout into extra kicks. Côte d'Ivoire, a team with continuously high expectations who hasn't brought it home yet in this current generation, begins to come undone during the shootout. Players are pacing around, visibly nervous. Conversely, the Chipolopolo stand together. The field microphones that captured the outburst of Hervé Renard through the match now pick up the Zambians, singing together again, like they did when they walked at the crash site just days earlier, singing to keep calm through the high-pressure situation. After the 7th Zambian hits his penalty, the Ivorians can't find a taker for their 8th. Kolo Touré volunteers, but the coach wants Gervinho to take it and calls Touré back, but Gervinho refuses, forcing Kolo Touré to make the long walk to the penalty spot a second time. With a massive run-up, he hits a weak shot and Mwene makes the save. And suddenly it's match point for the
couple of
Chipolopolo.
games didn't play so well today. Kalaba. Rainford Kalaba.
The singing had quieted down during
To
the
put
extra
Zambia.
kicks, but here it starts up again, louder than before. And Rainford Kalaba, the midfield genius behind the Zambian run, steps up to win the African Cup of Nations. After Kalaba's miss, Didier Drogba, the Ivorian captain, has to personally go up and tell Gervinho to take the next one, and this time he accepts the challenge. The temperamental and reluctant Arsenal star comes up. The Zambians now have a second chance at glory. It had to be this way. When the team that announced itself with 4-0 in the Seoul Olympics died, it seemed like Zambia would never have another chance that good. When the resurrected side of the 90s failed at the last hurdle, it seemed like they might never reach that stage again. When Kalaba's penalty sailed over the bar, it seemed as if they had lost their only opportunity, but they're still here. The Zambian singing starts up again, even louder than the last time. This is a story full of second chances, and now at the very sight of tragedy comes another second chance at redemption. In this story so illustrative of the will to overcome, it's everything there is to love about sport, drama, and a movingly human story behind it all. The singing continues as Stopila Sunzu steps up. He's singing too. Sunzu's penalty will be the 18th of this shootout, one for every player who died in the 1993 plane crash. Kalusha Bwalya, the man who's been through all of this, is here, having been the architect from the top of this latest resurgence, and one can only imagine his emotions at seeing these players at the precipice, with a second chance of achieving the dream that 18 of his friends and teammates had died for. He knows better than anyone else the magic that can run through Independence Stadium in Lusaka, and even though they aren't there now, the meaning instilled in Libreville by the plane crash that ended a golden generation here had brought the magic to Gabon for a night, and had inspired the Zambians to play the game of their lives and finally make good on those promises past. The 18th taker steps up to finally bestow the highest honor upon the legacy of the 18 heroes who died in Libreville, and to finish this life-affirming story. From Kalusha Bwalya to Stopila Sunzu, in loving memory.
Musonda carried on to the pitch by his coach to sing with his teammates. Destiny and fate clearly were in Zambia's dugout tonight.